Yeah, I am Richard DeGeorge. I am an emeritus professor from University of Kansas, where I had various positions. I was distinguished professor of philosophy, of Soviet and East European studies, and an adjunct professor in the business school, and I was co-director of the International Center for Ethics in Business. I have an honorary doctorate from the University of Nyenrode, and what impresses people more than the fact that I have an honorary doctorate is that on the stage with me when I got it were two other people who got honorary doctorates, Bill Gates and Nelson Mandela. Okay, there was no field, so I wasn't brought to the field. In a lot of ways, I was part of a group that made the field. But let me tell you a little bit about my interests. I've been interested in ethics, not meta-ethics, but ethics as it applies to society. And one of the first books I did was in 1966, when I invited a group of philosophers and other people actually to talk about ethics and society. What does ethics have to contribute to society? And some of these were people who did mostly meta-ethics, people like Charles Stevenson, Henry Aiken. Brand Blanchard was an idealist, but he didn't do applied ethics at all. So I had a whole gamut of people whom I asked to turn their attention to how does ethics apply in society? What difference does it make? And that was picked up as an Anchor Doubleday book and sold very well, so that 50,000 copies were sold. And the royalties went to my university. I'll just add that because they had paid for the series. But that shows you that I was interested in the practical aspects of how do you apply ethics to society early on. In 1978, Ethics, Free Enterprise, and Public Policy appeared, and both the conference and the book got the attention of NEH, and NEH called up the dean and said, how would you like $300,000 to work on the relation of business and the humanities? So we considered it for 2 seconds and said yes. And under that program, I developed a course in business ethics, which I thought was the appropriate answer to the Marxist challenge. And as part of the grant, I wrote up a 90-page booklet on how to teach business ethics. And I used the book that we had published as the basis and developed the course, and then sent out a notice saying, I have a 90-page booklet on how to teach business ethics. Who wants it? And I was surprised to get 900 people who wanted it, which told me, well, this must be an area in which there is interest and maybe a need. So I set to work writing what I thought was a basic text on business ethics, which was then published in 1982 and went through 7 editions. And I envisaged that book as being an attempt to show people how one could systematically approach business ethics. So people run corporations, people are in corporations, but yet will say Ford Motor Company is responsible and is guilty, morally guilty, for making the Pinto, which led to deaths of some people. can we really talk about business being moral or immoral, corporation being moral or immoral? Or is that a mistake? Are only people moral or immoral? We use moral terms with respect to corporations, but before we go too far, we should ask ourselves, do we mean the same things by the terms? Do we know what we really mean when we say, oh, the corporation is a bad corporation or a good corporation? What does that mean? So there are a lot of really philosophical questions that had to be answered. And I tried to unpack the language of ethics. An important part of what business did was international. There were international questions. Can we export our view of what business should be to other countries? How do you negotiate what's going on in the rest of the world? And after the fall of the Soviet Union, the question was, what do we do with newly emerging countries, with new countries? What do we do with countries that are corrupt? How do we handle business while the responsibilities of business going into those areas, should they go in? So there were international problems. And finally, there were global problems, questions that we couldn't handle individually or by negotiation between or among countries, such as the ozone layer. Everybody had to take part in that if we were to do something about the hole in the ozone layer. That was a global problem. There were already climate issues that were developing. There were the questions of, does one country owe something to other countries, rich to poor? How do we negotiate that? So that my view was, we can have a comprehensive view of all these issues, and a field should consist of systematically developing all of that in one big picture. And then we see how the little pieces fit in, and individuals contribute as they want. Well, we're not dealing very well with the problem of inequality. And inequality is really a big issue now. It always has been, but taking central stage. And I don't find that people in business ethics are providing any particular insight. They are joining in the discussion, but not as much as I think they could. And I think there would be more to be done on that whole issue. So inequality is one. Global issues, global warming. We have a lot of people talking about global warming, certainly a big problem, but also there's a great deal of confusion. And I think it would be nice to have some more philosophers step in and say, look, let's discuss global warming intelligently, and let's talk about the different approaches and which ones carry more weight, which ones respect people more, which one will have a better influence on the world as a whole, rather than just talk in slogans and have people adopt one view rather than another. I think philosophers have more to contribute to that, and people in business ethics especially, and we're not doing a good job. There's so much talk about ethics in business that it's now respectable to do so. And in fact, businesses often go out of their way to present themselves as being ethical. Now, that's a major change. And I think if I go through the history of how this developed, the people that you're considering pioneers for this series played a very important role in that. No one person can take the credit, but working together, each from our own perspective, each doing different things and each taking a different angle and developing it, we had an impact.